Depending on what state you grew up in the US during middle school to early high school, you were most likely shown at least one video on puberty, the menstruation cycle, and sex education. The history of sex education videos has been a long and complex one, from disease prevention to open discussions on sex and sexuality. The first films that were made in the early 1900s focused on venereal diseases since they were spreading over the US. This was a way of educating Americans about them. Especially amongst the men in the army who were drafted to the First World War, many of them had learned they had a venereal disease during their physical exams, and these films were a way of educating and warning the soldiers about them. In 1922's Science of Life, male sexual desire is depicted as a stallion that can lead masculine qualities which make men ambitious to strive and achieve, but must be reined in. Women's sexual urges are not mentioned. Instead, the focus of the film is on women's reproductive capacity. There was a very anti-female tone during this time. The films are often blaming prostitutes for the venereal diseases and making them out to be the source of all of them. This was obviously not the case, since many men were passing the disease on to women as well, but using women as the carrier in these films and health pamphlets was their main tactic. According to Newsweek, during the 1920s, somewhere between 20 and 40% of high schoolers had sex education programs. The 20s brought the flapper movement, in which young women embraced the sexual liberation, and with venereal diseases still wreaking havoc on Americans, there was more of an urge for high schoolers and universities to cover these topics. Because of this, by the 1930s, the U.S. Office of Education first published sex education materials and began training teachers. During World War II in the 1940s, women are framed as the issue again, as they were in World War I. The running theme through World War II sex education films is that female sexuality is a serious threat to men's dominance. Many films display an image of how good girls can still carry diseases. However, also at this time, the U.S. government got ahead of a potential venereal disease crisis among the troops by issuing condoms and aggressively marketing a prevention campaign. They were very effective in pushing the importance of condoms. Since teenagers were raising themselves during World War II with their fathers off serving and their mothers working at factories, America began to panic as they saw teens having way more freedom than ever before. There was a fear that the traditional family was dead and people were starting to not want marriage or kids as they did before. In an attempt to correct the course of American youth, CornoNet Instructional Media Company produced a number of films in the 40s and 50s that were intended to re-socialize teenagers and teach them how to engage with one another in a traditional gendered way that would lead to becoming good workers and respectable married adults with children of their own. The FDA approved oral contraception, or birth control pills, for prescription use in the United States in 1960. In 1964, Mary Calderon, medical director at Planned Parenthood, established the national nonprofit organization Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, or SIECUS, in New York City to promote comprehensive sexual education. SIECUS programs for schools began to include information on birth control methods, teen pregnancy, masturbation, and gender relation. In the 1960s, feminine hygiene brands were given the opportunity to make films about menstruation, which also in turn was advertising for their products. These films on menstruation proved to be great movies. After classroom screenings, girls would receive branded pamphlets on menstruation and the process of becoming a woman, as well as period journals with prominent advertising for the company's sanitary napkins, a practice that is still used today in 6th grade. Even Disney made a film called The Story of Menstruation in 1946. The 1970s brought the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement, which led to new strides in these sex education films. New films challenged the traditional notion of marriage and sexuality, addressed issues around feminism and homosexuality, and these films finally had inclusion of people of color and mixed-race couples. With the 1980s bringing the AIDS crisis, these sex education videos became even more vital. Robert Ebron, an English professor at Oakland University and the author of Sex Ed, Film, Video, and the Framework of Desire, says, "The impetus for a defiant change in acceleration of warning films came with AIDS. Those movies are quite powerful, actually, and in the context of those, you get a lot of very frank discussions about sexuality, and women's sexual needs are given more foregrounding. You see stuff in these movies that you would have never seen 5 years before the AIDS crisis." In the 1990s, we start to see the push for abstinence-only education. In 1996, the Welfare Reform Act includes a provision that provides tens of millions of dollars to abstinence-only programs. Under President George W. Bush, funding for abstinence-only education skyrocketed. In 2000, Congress created even more funding and more restrictions for abstinence-only education with the passing of the Community-Based Abstinence Education Program. A whole issue that could be dived into is the difference in sex education in public schools versus private schools, a discussion we see start to get heated in the 2000s and is still a big discussion today. Nowadays, it varies state to state how sex education is taught, but many schools still incorporate abstinence as their main way of going about it. To end this, I think this quote from Rick Prelinger, who's an archivist, sums up sex education videos very well. "A lot of the films that appear ridiculous today have a kernel of truth in them," he says. "They were made in part for good reasons, in some cases to try and relieve suffering. They may have been racist and nativist, but they were also trying to make people healthier. We can laugh at them, but if we take a nuanced look, there is much more than that going on."